On a warm summer morning, an American B-29 bomber flew over the blue skies of Hiroshima, Japan, carrying an entirely new weapon of war. Released with a parachute, a 10,000-pound atomic bomb fell slowly towards the bustling city center. And then, in a flash, the city disappeared into dust. The buildings, homes, and people vaporized instantly. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped that finally led to Japan's surrender, bringing a frightening end to a terrible war. But what led to the dropping of the atomic bombs? And what ultimately convinced American leaders to believe it was the morally right thing to do? Well, that's the lesson we're here to explore. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. The egg-shaped bomb dropped on Hiroshima was nicknamed Little Boy and had the power of 15,000 tons of TNT. The crew aboard the Enola Gay looked back at the city after they released the uranium bomb. They had no idea what to expect, if it would even work. But the pilot, Paul Tibbets, reminded the men aboard to put on their special dark glasses, and 42 seconds after releasing Little Boy, a scalding light flashed through the plane and temporarily blinded Tibbets. The men sat in silence. 2 shock waves ripped through the plane as a mushroom cloud tens of thousands of feet high billowed over the city. The co-pilot, Robert Lewis, wrote in his logbook, "My God, what have we done?" And that's what we're here to find out today. And this is going to be a heavy one. The dropping of the atomic bombs is one of the most debated topics in US history. And I'm not going to tell you what the right decision was because I don't know and it's not my job. I'm going to try to lay out the situation that America was facing and that Japan was facing so that you can ultimately understand the history as it was. So our exploration question is, what ultimately convinced President Truman that dropping the atomic bomb was the morally right thing to do? But first, do some stretching because we got some heavy history to lift. After the Pearl Harbor attack and the destruction of America's fleet, Japan had a firm hold on the Pacific, and their navy seemed invincible. But as America was mobilizing and rebuilding, cryptanalysts broke the Japanese military code. They learned that the Japanese Navy planned to attack Midway Island as an outpost to launch future attacks on Hawaii and potentially the West Coast. Knowing their plans just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, America was now ready to catch the Japanese off guard. The Battle of Midway was the first naval battle in history that actually didn't involve ships. Instead, planes launched from aircraft carriers did the damage. In their victory, America inflicted heavy damages on Japan, including the sinking of 4 aircraft carriers. It turned the tide of the war. Japan would now be on the defensive from here on out. The next major battle took place on the Solomon Islands in Guadalcanal. 10,000 Marines landed and were introduced to the horrific fighting conditions that would mark the Pacific theater. Sweltering heat, tropical diseases, and parasites made just surviving a living hell. The Marines also realized just how determined and fearless the Japanese soldiers were. Ordered to die rather than surrender, they fought on for 6 grueling months before America secured the island. American military leaders developed the strategy of island hopping. American forces would slowly work their way to Japan by leapfrogging from one strategic island to the next. But they would also ignore certain islands that were heavily defended or less strategically important. As American forces island hopped their way closer to Japan, fighting grew increasingly bloody as the Japanese dug in their heels. On February 19, 1945, American Marines invaded Iwo Jima, a tiny island 700 miles from Japan. 18,000 Japanese defenders were dug deep into cement bunkers, and over 99% fought to their deaths, a number unrivaled in history, but was characteristic of the Japanese forces. To surrender was the ultimate disgrace for a Japanese soldier, and it explains the horrific and torturous treatment that American and Allied prisoners of war received from the Japanese. Whereas less than 1% of American POWs died at the hands of the Nazis, 39% died in Japan's captivity. But after a month and over 25,000 casualties, America took Iwo Jima, and 6 Marines raised the American flag over Mount Suribachi, which became one of the most iconic images of the war. At the next battle at Okinawa, Americans suffered 50,000 casualties but were inching closer to victory. American forces then faced the dreadful prospect of an invasion of Japan. With the war over in Europe, everything seemed to come down to this frightful conclusion. If the Japanese refused to surrender on tiny islands thousands of miles from home, it was hard to imagine how fiercely they would fight to defend their own shores. But unbeknownst to them, back at home, American scientists were closing in on the completion of a top-secret new weapon that could make the invasion completely unnecessary. In 1939, famed scientist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt warning him that German scientists were working to develop a new bomb that would give them unrivaled power. Ultimately, this led Roosevelt to create the Manhattan Project, to devote massive resources for a top-secret mission to develop an atomic bomb. The main research facility was located in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where a whole city was developed to coordinate this massive scientific experiment. In 1945, when President Roosevelt died from a stroke after 14 years in office, Vice President Truman had not even heard of the project. Then, when Truman was in Potsdam, Germany, meeting with Allied leaders Churchill and Stalin, Truman was informed that the first test of the atomic bomb in the New Mexican desert was successful. The gamble paid off. At Potsdam, tensions were developing between Truman and Stalin over the future of Europe after the war. America and the Soviet Union had radically different visions for the post-war world, but having a monopoly on nuclear weapons gave Truman quite the bargaining chip, and Stalin was watching closely to what America would do with it. Foreshadowing! Despite the tensions, the Allies still drafted the Potsdam Declaration that outlined the terms for the unconditional surrender of Japan. It included removing all their present leadership, punishment of war criminals, and there were many, and the creation of a new democratic government that guaranteed human rights for the Japanese people, and if they refused, they would face prompt and utter destruction. Japanese leaders ignored the Potsdam Declaration and readied their defenses for an invasion. But even before the invasion and before the development of the atomic bomb, American planes had already been raining hellfire on Japanese cities. The plane added a terrible new dimension to warfare in World War II. All the major powers practiced carpet bombing of civilian centers. Dresden, Germany was turned into rubble from British and American bombings. In Japan, with their timber buildings and bamboo homes, the firebombings of cities brought horrific civilian casualties, in hopes to destroy military targets, but also to break the will of the people to carry on. American planes also dropped hundreds of thousands of leaflets urging civilians to evacuate cities and to pressure their government to end the war, but it had little effect. And before the bomb was completed, the plan to invade Japan was titled Operation Downfall. Predictions for Allied casualties differed, but many believed it would be at least 1 million and potentially 10 million Japanese casualties. And it could take years while Americans at home were already war-weary and desperate to get their husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers home safely. For President Truman and most military leaders, the choice was simple. The bomb would save hundreds of thousands of American lives and bring a quick end to the war, ultimately saving millions of Japanese as well. As he said, it was a terrible decision, but I made it. When pilot Paul Tibbets and his crew took off for Hiroshima that morning, they hoped that by the time they returned, the war might be over. At Hiroshima that morning, air raid alarms sounded, and civilians rushed into their bomb shelters. But at 8 a.m., the alarm was canceled, and people returned to the streets going about their mornings. At 8:15, Little Boy exploded. 4 square miles were left in utter ruin. 70 to 80,000 died instantly, and another 70,000 would die from after effects from the burns and radiation. But still, the Japanese military leaders vowed to fight on. 3 days later, Truman ordered the dropping of Fat Man. On August 9th, the bombing crew headed for the city of Kokura, but clouds obscured the city, and after 3 passes, the pilot headed off to Nagasaki, the next city on the list. Now, Nagasaki was not even originally on the list of the 5 proposed cities. Kyoto was. But Secretary of State Henry Stimson had honeymooned in Kyoto with his wife and loved the city, so he pressured Truman to spare it for its cultural and religious importance, and Nagasaki took its place. It's one of those random acts that ends up changing the fate of history. And on August 9th, a second atomic bomb wiped out Nagasaki, killing another 75,000 people. The decision to drop the bombs has been criticized for a whole number of reasons. Some felt Japan was already looking to surrender and offering slightly different terms would have gotten them to do so. Others argued that the dropping of the atomic bomb was not just inhumane, but would invite other nations to use these weapons in the future. Still others believe that the bomb was actually more to demonstrate to Stalin and the Soviets the extent of America's power, and were entirely unnecessary to win the war. In that respect, the bombs didn't just end World War II, they also kickstarted the Cold War. But to Truman and most military leaders, there were no signs that Japan's resolve was softening, and they had proven entirely intolerant towards surrender throughout the war. Only unspeakable destruction might change their minds. And perhaps it did, because 9 days later, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, who was viewed as a god by his people, came over the radio for the first time and announced the surrender of Japan. There would be no invasion. American sailors, Marines, and all military personnel rejoiced, and American families back home celebrated. A formal surrender ceremony took place on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. With tears in their eyes, Japanese military commanders signed their surrender. Afterwards, General MacArthur gave a speech stating, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." When the ceremony was over, the sun broke through the clouds and shined brightly across Tokyo Bay. In the years after the war, America and Japan grew to be close allies that they still are today. So, the world changed forever in an instant at Hiroshima. Humanity was now in the atomic age, and the prospect of future Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's hung over the heads of world leaders for decades. Albert Einstein said, "The atomic bombs changed everything, except the nature of man." But today, as we have tens of thousands of nuclear bombs, tens of thousands times more powerful than the ones used in 1945, we best develop a Manhattan Project devoted to improving the nature of man, so we can learn to live in peace with one another with these weapons, and someday perhaps to live without them entirely. So, thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video, and I gotta ask, could you do that noble little act and click the thumb that looks kind of like this, and you can hit subscribe to get updates on all our new histories that we're gonna be dropping. And for teachers and homeschool parents, on my website, historyforhumans.com, there are resources and lesson plans that go with all my videos that can save you time and stress and energy so that you can just enjoy exploring history and not worrying about the rest of the mess. And if you're doing the learning activity that you can find on my website, hang on, because we got instructions in just a sec. Okay, I think you know what you're going to be doing for this activity. You're going to be pretending to be an advisor, or if you're in groups, advisors, to President Truman, and you're going to have to help him make this difficult decision. Now, we know that he thought it was rather obvious, but others disagreed, and you're going to have to dive deep into some serious primary sources to guide your thinking. For each of the sources, you're going to have to answer a few guided questions before bringing them all together and then writing a speech or a letter to the president regarding what he should do. Make sure to reference some documents within your letter to give it authority and speak with some passion to try to really convince him. All right, guys, drop an anvil on this one and crush it.